I'm bringing back on forensic death investigator Joseph Scott Morgan to go over the latest developments in the David murder case. Issues involving whether 14-year-old Celeste Rivas Hernandez was ever pregnant. Was she potentially killed in Santa Barbara? Is there evidence of a cleanup? What will the defense do to fight back against maybe cause or manner of death? And if so, a lot of questions leading up to a major hearing on the horizon. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. Forensics, analyzing the science, the body, the crime scene. It is the key to so many cases that we have covered here, and I think it is going to play a massive role in the David case. But I want to better understand it. I want to better understand how the potential evidence may tie to the singer. What answers are still missing? What does her autopsy, the alleged crime scene, the evidence tell us or not tell us? How is the defense going to be fighting back on this? And I'm talking, of course, about the 21-year-old romantic homicide singer charged with first-degree murder, continuous sexual abuse of a child under 14, and unlawful mutilation of human remains, all in connection with the death of 14-year-old Celeste Rivas Hernandez, who was found dead, reportedly in David's Tesla at a Hollywood tow yard back on September 8th of last year. He's entered a not guilty plea. He's innocent until proven guilty. There is a preliminary hearing scheduled for May 26th, important date, because that is when the prosecution will present not all the evidence, but what they will say is sufficient evidence to support these charges to move forward with the case. But authorities say that David stabbed Celeste to death at his property to keep her quiet, that he lied in wait, that he had this alleged illegal sexual relationship with her, that she was a minor, killed her because she was a witness, that she was going to expose him, did it for financial gain, prevent her from tanking his career, which was at its peak. But again, I want to understand the forensics. Okay, I want to bring on Joseph Scott Morgan, forensic death investigator from Jacksonville State University, host of the Body Bags podcast. Hope everybody can check it out. Joseph's got like the best voice possible, I think in general for the podcast realm, but also particularly for that show. Thank you so much for taking the time.
You bet, my friend.
I did a really super short opening so I could have a lot of time with you because I have a lot of questions. I don't know if you and I even talked about the medical examiner's report of the autopsy here on Sidebar. Just general impressions about that, because I do wonder, it tells us a lot, but then there's aspects of it I do wonder, how do investigators, how do authorities know this? So for example, prosecutors say in their brief, defendant stabbed the victim to death multiple times and stood by while she bled out. How do they know that? How do they know that? And I also wonder specifically, if I'm correct, they don't have the murder weapon.
No, to the best of my knowledge, they don't. But back to that earlier point, how do they know that he stood there? Because, look, I got to tell you, as an old investigator, you know where I get that kind of information from? It's not from the perpetrator. To say someone stands there and watches an individual bleed out, that comes from a witness. And that's the one thing that's left me scratching my head over all of this. You know how? Because that is a huge leap. If you're talking about an investigative descriptor, that is such a leap to make that affirmative statement, because I can tell you when their feet are put to the fire relative to any kind of trial that's going to come about, that question is going to be asked and it is going to have to be answered. You said in the report right here that he stood there while she bled out. So unless they have internal cameras that bore witness to this, unless there was something that was caught on a Tesla, that's the only other path I can really go down relative to that.
Unless they're just assuming this based on the idea of, look, we can say multiple penetrating wounds, right? I believe that's what they said the cause of death was, and they're saying we're putting two together, right? She allegedly came to the house at this time. We know that he allegedly sent a text to her phone 20 minutes later. We believe a sharp instrument was used, and so we are saying, of course, he stabbed her, and if he stabbed her, of course, he just waited for her to bleed out because he allegedly never called 911 or authorities, and so that's what they're assuming. But you're saying, in your experience, they shouldn't or wouldn't make that statement. There was no need to make that statement unless they have some sort of information.
Yeah, man, it's just such a huge leap, to go down that road. For me, and I'm going to tell you, that is going to have to be revealed in court. And you know as well as anybody that you cannot just kind of in some kind of pedestrian manner, just go by and say, yeah, well, this is what happened. You're going to have to explain that. I mean, because people are going to want to know. This is arguably one of the most gruesome things that we've covered in some time. And I'm not saying it doesn't matter what people think, but I think that even the court is going to want that explained. If defense looks at this and said, how do they know that? They can't just say, well, we just know. They're going to have to lay that down, the facts, right? Just like in forensic science, we like to deal with the facts. We like to deal with those absolutes. When you get inside the courtroom, you have to state the facts of the case. And this is what they're saying is a fact of the case. So I'm going to be fascinated to see how this is explained, because I don't know, man. Inquiring minds want to know, right?
This goes to another part, and correct me if I'm wrong, and I talked to Steve Fisher about this on my News Nation show. There was no cleaning supplies, right? There's no evidence that, as far as I can see in the filings, that there was this massive cleanup and luminol and things like that. And you're talking about a very graphic alleged crime, a stabbing and then dismemberment. So the reason I'm bringing this up is Steve has put forward this idea, a question about whether or not this killing happened, this alleged killing, this alleged murder happened in the house. That she arrives 20 minutes later, he sends an alibi text. So this is from the prosecution's filing, and then I'll read you what Steve said. Despite knowing she was dead and her family was trying to find her, the evidence will show the defendant lied and claimed he didn't know where she was. In fact, the defendant drove to Santa Barbara County immediately after the victim died, attempting to dispose of her property and destroy evidence. At approximately 11:30 p.m. on April 23, 2025, he drove away from his home as he texted and called the victim's phone, asking where she was. Again, these were acts calculated and planned to set up his defense within a very short timeline after the victim's vicious murder. Defendant drove his Tesla north on the 101 freeway to San Marcos Pass Road, SR 154, near Lake Cachuma in Santa Barbara County. He returned home early the following morning on April 24, 2025, before going to a radio interview for the release of his album that week. He sent 2 additional texts to the victim's phone that day, which obviously went unanswered because she was already dead. After April 26, 2025, defendant never attempted to contact her again. May 8, 2025, defendant returned to the same area in Santa Barbara County, leaving his home at around 11:30 p.m. He returned to the area again on May 31st, 2025. This is an isolated site off SR 154 where the victim's identification was subsequently discovered in January 2026. Additionally, on July 7th, 2025, defendant ordered and subsequently Amazon delivered a burn cage to his home under the same fake name as part of his plan to incinerate evidence. Defendant's cellular activity and communications derived from defendant's phone and Tesla demonstrate defendant's activities from April 22nd to April 24th, including a trip to Santa Barbara in the middle of the night after the victim arrived at his Hollywood Hills home. Steve Fisher posted, "Can't stop thinking about the timeline of the murder of Celeste Rivas Hernandez," and put forward in the pre-trial brief. Could the 10:30 p.m. "where are you" text messages actually be real and not a staged alibi? Could Celeste have walked away after an argument upon arriving in the Uber? Maybe those texts from David asking where she was were real, and after he didn't receive a response, he went looking for her, found her, and they ended up driving to Santa Barbara County where the killing actually occurred. He could have shut her phone off when finding her. In that scenario, her body could have remained along SR 154 for the roughly 12 days until the pool, body bag, laundry bags, and chainsaws were ordered and delivered. It is also worth noting that the pool was ordered after her death, meaning it would not have contained blood from the actual killing. The DA's version of events is a very compressed timeline. Arrival at 10:10 p.m., a fatal stabbing, and then being composed enough to send an alibi text by 10:30 p.m. That is a 20-minute window. They also claim the trip to Santa Barbara that evening was to start disposing of evidence. However, the evidence had not even been purchased yet. The pool, chainsaw, shovel, and other items had not even been ordered at the time of the first Santa Barbara trip. There's also the question of storing a body at his manager Josh Marshall's rental house for 12 days while waiting for tools, where nearby neighbors and decomposition odors likely becoming noticeable within a few days, all while David was out of town and having to trust that nobody would enter a house that wasn't even leased to him. None of this changes the central point that David is responsible. He killed Celeste, that I am certain of. Like I said, the DA is likely correct in their theory. They are working with all the evidence. Hashtag David, hashtag Celeste Rivas Hernandez. So talk to me about that. I mean, in the idea of the compressed timeline, I haven't seen evidence of this massive cleanup. I do wonder, despite what the prosecution's saying, do you believe there's evidence, enough evidence, that this killing, alleged killing, happened in the house?
There was a sufficient amount of time for there to have been a cleanup affected. Okay. And here's the thing that I can't get past with that. And I I think Steve has done a fantastic job. I've been on a number of platforms with him, spoken with him extensively, because he's really been the only insight that we've had, right? I mean, truly, from that perspective, because he was eyes on, and one of his big points along the way is that I can't remember if he luminoled or blue starred. He had made the statement to me, the residents in those areas, and he didn't get hit relative to anything that would indicate that there was blood in the garage. Again, we're going back to what the authorities are stating here in the affirmative, that it took place in the garage. Well, how do you know that? And it brings me back to the thought of the chainsaw. With a chainsaw, from a utility, is a very messy device to use, and it creates a storm of things of evidentiary value. So where did all of that go? I've thought about, was it the backyard perhaps? Not kind of thinking, what's more reasonable, that he would go to Santa Barbara. And Santa Barbara County, I've been there a couple of times. Yeah, I mean, you can say that it's right up the road, but is it really up the road? And why would you go that far? I don't understand that, to deposit evidence or any kind of ID and things like this. I know I'm kind of bouncing around, but the other bit of evidence here is that why would you need a pool? Are you going to go out there and inflate a pool in order to facilitate this? They also talk about, in the filings, they talk about that there was bits of blue plastic that are embedded into these injuries. I can see that. I understand why there would be. A chainsaw moves at 14,000, 15,000 RPM. All right. So it's going to chew through just about anything, not just, human tissue, but if you've got an underlying kiddie pool, it's going to go through that as well. And then the idea that it would get embedded into the insults, into the injuries, it makes sense. I could see that happening. Now, the criminalists actually have those bits. That's not for the forensic pathologist to talk about tying things back relative to the forensics there. They had those bits already. Matter of fact, there was a criminalist at the scene in the car lot. They actually had a criminalist present, I think, at autopsy. They talk about at autopsy, those bits are turned over. So how are you going to go about explaining that? What's the utility of a kiddie pool out in some remote area? Why not just do it on bare earth out there? And again, thinking as a forensics guy, I'm trying to understand the utility of all of this. It seems like you're really using you in the universal sense here. You're really going a long way around the barn here in order to facilitate, the killing and dismemberment. So I honestly, I don't know. It's
Right.
It's baffling to me.
Well, look, I think the purchase history is quite damning for him. Look, he's innocent until proven guilty, but the idea of they can track the purchases and when he allegedly made these purchases and what the items were and when they arrived, and if they're able to allegedly track his movements and the Santa Barbara, the cell phone. But I think the idea also, and I thought this was significant, the filing says that he lied to friends, business associates, and others about the strong smell of decay in and around the home and the car. And TMZ published this video, and I don't know if it's going to be a part of evidence, but I thought it was significant that it was reportedly from July 4th, 2025, a live stream. So it was, again, a few months after the alleged murder. And according to a prosecutor brief, that was only a few weeks later, July 29th, when, quote, the surveillance video and other evidence confirm defendant was the last person to drive the vehicle on July 29th, 2025, before he left Los Angeles on a concert tour. Not entirely clear. Maybe someone else could have picked up the car. But anyway, in this clip, David appears to be with Neil Langston, appears to be with someone named Sukana, and he apologizes for the way his bathroom smells, says it was because he had gone to the bathroom 2 hours earlier. I mean, could very well be it, but if there was potentially this smell, it does beg the question about, how that factors into this case.
What my question is this, all right, what would be the purpose of even making that statement? Is that a statement that someone would actually make, about, I mean, I don't know, maybe you feel comfortable around the crowd that you're around. So if that's the case, okay, good on him. He's trying to explain a bad odor, but had he ever done that before? You know what? And also there is a gulf of difference between a bathroom smell and the smell of a child decomposing. Uh, a gulf, all right. And so, is that an attempt to explain this odor away? And the thing about it, Jesse, is that smell. People think that they have smelled bad things, all right, and I guess you can scale that out any number of ways. If you've never been around decomposing remains, it's a smell that kind of haunts you. Even me, at this stage of my life, I still recall it instantaneously. It's something you don't forget, and it is completely different than a smell that would emanate from a bathroom. It was just an odd statement. I actually I heard this video, and um, it seemed kind of out of place for me. Uh, and anybody could read anything they want to into that. It was very bizarre. And again, we're taking a random statement out of the air. We don't know what other statements had been made at that period of time, but TMZ chose that slice and they put it out there. Now, whether or not that would make it into court, I don't know, but I can tell you everybody that's contained in that video, I think, is subject to be subpoenaed. Because if that's what was being said, they can just be put on the stand and say, "Did you ever smell a foul odor in that house in any way?" And ask that question over and over and over again. I don't know how many times they would allow that. What witnesses there are. I saw that there was a young lady in that video. I don't know who she is. And then you've got the other gentleman who's supposed to be the personal assistant, which, if you watch him, in that clip, he never cracks a smile and he just kind of looks up like that. I think people use that term, the side eye, essentially, is what he did. He was kind of expressionless when that's said. It's intriguing. I mean, it truly is.
And the timing of it, like in that time frame, I think is interesting as well. Joseph, one of the things we didn't get a chance to talk about, and I have a lot more I want to get into.
Sure.
The autopsy, right? I mean, look, from a legal point of view, the significance of that, in any case, you have to establish as an element of the crime that someone was killed. And so the autopsy, you're going to have the medical examiner testify and talk about the cause of death, the manner of death. Talk to me, though, about how what you read may actually tie back to David. So there's the significance of the report. We were all waiting for the report. It was sealed for months and months and months. What is the thing that stood out to you the most about it? And also, how do you think it may potentially be used to actually tie back?
Yeah, let's break that down in categories. First off, let's start with the big piece to this. And that's going to be, I think, the most glaring thing, and they'll see crime scene images of this, is the level of decomposition, how advanced she was. Okay. And you can talk about that, which it's well stated in the autopsy report. You can talk about in what an advanced state of decomposition she's in. And that's really going to assault the senses of the jury here. Okay. They also talk about liquefaction, which is something we haven't really, heard before. In this case, how the remains are partially liquefied. And that's going to be a place where I think the defense, I'm always thinking about what the defense could do. They can step in and say, well, you're saying the body is partially liquefied. How can you actually identify, these insults, these injuries? Well, they were able to identify that to a great degree. And so part one is they're going to talk about the status of her body, and also how the body is in multiple elements and it's bagged separately, which is something that's intriguing. I'd love to go back to the body bag and talk about that, because that, on an aside, that's a fascinating element to me. But let's make it through the rest of these. Then you get down to the nature of the cause of death, and they're saying that this is a sharp force event. They didn't say, which is not unusual. I don't think that they alluded to whether this is a single-edged or double-edged weapon. assuming, which is dangerous to do. It's a single-edged weapon. And if our friends that are listening will just understand where these two insults are, I think that's important for folks to understand. Jesse, you and I have talked so many times over the past decade, about multiple injuries. And when you hear multiple, most of the time, and how many times have you and I talked about overkill, right? This doesn't fit in that category. They're talking about two lethal injuries here. And I question the lethality of one of these injuries. I know specifically the other one is very lethal. But let's start on the left aspect where Celeste had sustained sharp force injury in between her ribs. All right. And that's what's called the intercostal space. There's muscles. If you've ever worked out, if folks have ever worked out and you've pulled an intercostal muscle, it's one of the most painful things you can ever injure. It's that space between your ribs, and that is muscle. Well, it passes through there, and it doesn't really affect the lung. And it's hard to tell because she's in such an advanced state. I don't know if the lung was collapsed as a result of natural decompositional process, or if it may have been collapsed. But they don't even talk about, that this sharp instrument nicked the lung. What they do talk about, and this is very important from a forensic standpoint, is that blade actually passes over the cortex, or the outer layer of the rib. Now, what can we draw from that? Well, you can get a tool mark off of that. And I'm hoping that they retain that sample, because the pathologist goes into some explanation about that piece of rib. All right. And that's something that is commonly done in forensics labs, where once that bit of tissue, that rib, that bone is cleaned up, it would go to a tool mark examiner, and they'll do a gross examination. That means they're looking at it with an unaided eye. They'll put it on a magnification scope, look at it there. And what they're going to look for is any kind of specific impression that goes across that rib, and they can actually classify the edge that would have created that. Now, onto the lethal injury. If folks will find the bottom of the right aspect of your rib cage, your liver is right there. So you find the last rib on the right side and press in where the tissue is soft. That's your liver. All right. And you got to go through the dome of the diaphragm, essentially right there. But the liver is underlying. This injury is, I think, and I'm just doing this off the top of my head, so forgive me, I think it's 2 inches approximately in depth, but it's enough to nick the liver. And this goes back to the earlier statement we talked about with the bleeding out. The liver next to the brain is the most vascular organ in the body. I've had tons of liver injuries over the course of my career: gunshot wounds, stab wounds, motor vehicle accidents. And it is not a quick death. Just so everybody understands this. This is not like a gunshot wound to the head, or even a bludgeoning, or even a strangulation. Okay. So if someone is stabbed in this area, in the liver, you don't die instantly. This would have been a very protracted event, if that's the only injury that there was that had a level of lethality. Now, did they miss anything? Which is possible, because of the level of decomposition. Okay. Right now, I'm not thinking so. Okay. So that's an important part of this. And this goes back to the watching, doesn't it, Jesse? Right. This is an observable event. Watched her bleed out. And again, that's a very affirmative statement, that they're making. And it fits with, for me, it does, with this liver insult, because that is a location where it would take a protracted period of time to die.
Right. I go back to something that you said before, is, they'll make question, the defense may question, how can you definitively determine cause of death given the level of dismemberment and decomposition? What kind of expert do you think the defense would call to negate this? They've been very—
They're going to have a forensic pathologist.
Yeah, and how would that person dispute the official findings? Because again, the defense says he's not the cause of her death. There seems to be a dispute here. What room is there going to be for a forensic expert to disagree with the official findings?
I think that the one thing about it is you're going to have a forensic pathologist that has a very strong background. Most do, all right? in decomposed bodies. But you're going to have a defense pathologist that can at least insert that seed for reasonable doubt relative to the level of decomposition. I think that that's really the only intellectual underpinning that you have. You know, if you're trying to make that argument that you guys do in court, right? That's where you're going to go. They're going to have to lean into the decomposition. I know that sounds so bizarre, but for me, there's so much other evidence, digital evidence, circumstantial evidence, testimonial stuff that's going on, you know, in addition to the physical evidence that they have. This is a mountain. I mean, it's a mountain. I've seen, you know, cases with much less forensic evidence that have not gone well for the defendant. Decomposition, though, is going to be the big factor here, I think, and you're going to hear a lot about it. I think you're going to hear a lot about entomology in this case, because this goes back to, I talked to Steve about this too, the entomology element here is going to be a big part because, and forgive me, and certainly our listeners too, I don't mean to be insulting or be ghastly here.
It's important to talk about.
But with entomology, flies have a life cycle, okay? And I promise you, dollars to donuts, all right? Within that period of time that she died, I'd say probably within 5 hours, okay? Flies are already aware. So, and there it begins, and flies always find a way. There's nothing you can do to keep away flies, period, end of paragraph. So what they'll do is that they lay that little clutch of eggs that they all start off with. And that's where this timeline begins to tick, because maggots and flies both have cycles that they run through, and they're kind of set in stone, and that goes to timing, right? So you can have a body where you will have multiple generations of fly. The longer you go out, all right, and the longer there is viable tissue for them to, you know, consume, you're going to have flies. And so what they'll do is the entomologist, and I hope they did this both at the car. Remember in that statement that was released in that earlier document dump, when they opened that trunk, they observed insect activity there in the trunk, okay? My question is, are there any maggot husk or anything indicative of that body being placed somewhere on that property, okay, in the Hollywood Hills? And, you know, with an entomologist, that's an easy lift for them, because they would go out and inspect that area. They would see the husk that are there. That's going to be a big part to that as well. You're also going to see tool mark evidence. The pathologist makes note, they allude, and I'm paraphrasing here, they allude to kind of how cleanly these marks were made. Pathologists can kind of testify to that, but you really want a heavy hitter to come in a tool mark area. I'm just building out the team.
I remember they said multiple linear cuts when it came to the pool, you know? They talked about that.
And then we talked about the dismemberment of the body. Right. You marry that up with that, and these edges are very clean as they can be. And so that I've always felt as though when I heard that, and before I heard the chainsaw that they used, you know, they said this was a chainsaw. I knew that this was going to have to be a mechanical device that was utilized here. This is not, you know, going out to the shed and grabbing your dad's, you know, old carpenter saw.
Well, there's one more thing I want to get to with you, but
sure.
You know, the idea that you have this then 20-year-old singer murder her, buy the tools, dismember her, and seemingly, you know, all by himself, because no one else has been implicated, no one else has been arrested, no one else has been charged. It's just, it's quite a thing to be thinking about. And it goes to this final point, pregnancy. So this is a big issue that's come up. And the reason that this has come up is because in the prosecution's pretrial brief, they wrote, text exchanges between the victim and defendant contain references to sex, pregnancy, abortion, and use of the Plan B emergency contraceptive. There are also explicit photographs documenting and corroborating their sexual relationship. In November 2024, defendant and the victim broke up, although they continued to communicate, and text messages suggest they also continued to have sexual relations. And then just a few days ago, well, actually now maybe a little bit longer, maybe last week,
Yeah.
her death certificate was amended to suggest it was unclear if she was pregnant when she was killed. In other words, it was changed from not pregnant to unknown. Now, you and I spoke on my News Nation show, Jesse Weber Live, and you believe, right, the idea is because of the investigative findings, they have no choice but to make it unknown, right? Because here's the thing, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, about what the autopsy report says, but if prosecutors believe she was pregnant, I have to imagine they would have included it in their filings, because you're talking special circumstances allegations. What better way to prove that? What better way to prove motive, prove he silenced the witness, killed her for financial gain, than if she were pregnant? If she's pregnant with his child, you would include that. You would say this is definitive proof. I mean, how compelling would that be? They don't include that. So talk to me about what we're missing here, because, you know, if the report is now saying unknown, and yet have you seen any evidence to suggest that she was pregnant?
No, and as a matter of fact, I'm scrolling through the autopsy report right now for me, and this is something I'm so glad you asked me this, so thank you, because if I'm disappointed in anything in this particular case and with the autopsy and kind of what's being explained and what's not being explained, for my money, here's the troubling bit. When doctors, and I think probably even attorneys, but specifically doctors, when doctors do a dictation, okay, of their reports, all right, just follow what I'm saying. Give me a little bit of rope here.
Sure.
So when they're dictating, there are certain things in law and medicine that if you're going to cite something, or if you're going to, and it's not necessarily significant, but it is significant, they will say to the person that's on the other end, if they're just taping this, they'll say standard dictation insert, standard dictation insert. Jesse, my friend, if you'll go back and you'll look at this autopsy, as a matter of fact, if you wish, I can actually read it for you right now, because I got to tell you, when I'm seeing this, it looks like when it comes to the part of the autopsy report, I think that they went with standard dictation. And this is how the header is. The header is female reproductive tract, uterus present, not enlarged, without endometrial lesions and hemorrhage, ovaries, fallopian tubes, appropriate for age, without lesions, breast tissue, without lesions, other reproductive tract findings. That's what you're giving me? We're talking about a case where if you've got a child who has been engaged in allegedly sexual congress with a grown man, I think that one of the big questions here, I need more detailed information. You've been able to do this assessment on the uterus and say it's not enlarged, but that requires a deeper dive. When you look at this document, there's no like, we have dissected the uterus, we've gone through layer by layer, and these are our findings. Okay? It just like, wow, it's striking, you know, when you see it. I really hate if this is the truth, because as it turns out, this is going to be one of the big things that this whole investigation, this whole future trial, when and if it happens, it's going to come down to. Yeah. Because as you stated, this is motivation, right? Yeah. That's a central key. Granted, I know we don't have to prove motive, but if you're trying to understand something, I find that section itself wanting.
Well, it's important, again, to prove the special circumstances. I mean, that is kind of the why. It's right, the lying in wait. It's the financial gain. It's killing a witness. So there is an aspect of that they do have to prove. Look, Joseph, I appreciate you being so generous with your time on this and laying all this out. Thank you so much. I really wanted to have a discussion with you about this because we didn't have a full, in-depth breakdown of this the way that it needs to be conducted. So thank you so much. Good seeing you, my friend, and hope everybody can check out Body Bags.
Thank you.
And that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you should get your podcasts. You can also check us out on NBC's Peacock as well. If you want to follow me, X, Instagram, my News Nation show, Jesse Weber Live, Monday through Friday, 11 p.m. Eastern. See you next time, everybody.